All right, settle in because you're about to get a history lesson so unvarnished, it'll feel like you've been transported back to a leaky, rat-infested medieval chapel, complete with the lingering scent of unwashed humanity and suspiciously earthy incense. For centuries, when we think of the medieval priest, an image probably flickers to mind: a kindly, scholarly figure, perhaps a bit stern, but ultimately devoted. Clad in simple robes, eyes turned heavenward, diligently serving God and guiding his flock through the treacherous spiritual wilderness of the Middle Ages, a beacon of piety, a pillar of the community, a humble servant of the divine. So, subscribe. It's a lovely picture, isn't it? Very Pinterest-ready, very inaccurate. Because the reality, my dear historically curious friend, was often far, far more complicated. And by complicated, I mean hilariously, tragically, disturbingly, and often profanely human. Forget the stained glass saint. Prepare to meet a collection of characters who wouldn't look out of place in a particularly grim sitcom starring a perpetually exasperated deity. We're going to dive headfirst into the murky, malodorous waters of the medieval clerical underworld. This isn't your Sunday school version of history. This is the version where God's chosen were often just as venal, ambitious, lustful, and spectacularly incompetent as anyone else stumbling through the plague-ridden mud of the 14th century. Sometimes even more so. Consider this your official invitation to peel back the veil of spiritual reverence and behold the unholy chaos beneath. Over the next, well, let's just say a significant chunk of your precious time, we're embarking on an utterly unromantic journey. We'll explore the tangled roots of hypocrisy, the enduring allure of corruption, and the utterly mundane horrors that comprise the daily pastoral life for a man who, by divine decree, was meant to be above it all. Expect a deep dive, not into spiritual enlightenment, but into the practical, often greasy mechanics of how the medieval church actually functioned on the ground, warts and all. Mostly warts. Many, many warts. You might even find yourself wondering if, given the choice, you'd rather face a marauding Viking or the local parish priest trying to collect his tithes. Spoiler alert, the Viking was often more predictable. Now, who, you might ask, would choose such a life? Who among the teeming masses of peasantry, the ambitious merchants, the sword-swinging knights, would willingly trade the simple pleasures of a hearth and family for a life dedicated to spiritual service? And the answer, often enough, was someone who saw an angle, someone with options that were, shall we say, less appealing. Or someone who, by some divine twist of fate, genuinely felt a calling, though that calling might have been muffled by the clamor of more earthly ambitions. Imagine, for a moment, you're a third or fourth son in a minor noble family. The eldest gets the land, the second gets the sword, and you, well, you get a choice: a life of obscure servitude to a more powerful lord, or a life in the church. Suddenly, that humble cassock starts looking a lot like a tailored suit of armor against the vagaries of fate. The church offered a path to social mobility, guaranteed meals, often quite good ones, as we'll see, and a level of respect that a landless younger son could only dream of. Avoiding military service, a guaranteed roof over your head, and the chance to climb the ecclesiastical ladder from a humble village priest to, perhaps, a bishop with his own hunting hounds and a decent wine cellar, it wasn't exactly a hard sell. It was less a spiritual calling and more a robust career fair. Of course, there were those, a minority perhaps, who truly felt a genuine pull towards the divine. Young men, often from impoverished backgrounds, who saw the church as not just a meal ticket, but a genuine source of intellectual stimulation, spiritual comfort, or a way to serve the less fortunate. They truly believed in the divine mission. They were, in many ways, the outliers, the earnest few whose naive piety would soon be tested, then probably ground into a fine dust by the grimy realities of their chosen profession. Bless their little hearts. So, how exactly did one become a priest? Well, the training, much like medieval sanitation, was varied. On one end of the spectrum, you had genuinely dedicated scholars, poring over illuminated manuscripts in cathedrals, mastering Latin, Greek, and the intricate theological debates of the day. These were the intellectual heavyweights, the theologians who could argue the precise number of angels on a pinhead for days without breaking a sweat. And then, on the other, far more populous end, you had young men who might have learned a few Latin phrases by rote, enough to mumble through a mass, but whose grasp of theology was roughly on par with their understanding of quantum physics. Many were simply taught by an existing priest, who himself might have been barely literate, passing on a shaky understanding of rituals and dogma like a game of ecclesiastical telephone. The primary theological study might have involved memorizing the exact order of the Mass, perhaps with a few key prayers, and the understanding that you absolutely must not spill the wine. Heaven forbid. The ordination ceremony itself was a truly solemn affair. Imagine it. The incense thick in the air, the sonorous chanting, the shimmering vestments, the bishop laying hands upon your head, the ancient words consecrating you, setting you apart, declaring you a sacred vessel, a direct conduit to the divine. You'd kneel, swear your sacred vows, celibacy, poverty, obedience. The weight of eternity, the responsibility for immortal souls settling upon your shoulders. It was all very moving, very dramatic. And then you'd stand up, probably blink the incense out of your eyes, and get back to the actual business of being a priest. Because, as everyone in the room, from the lowliest altar boy to the most revered bishop, knew with a collective, unspoken sigh, those vows were largely, shall we say, aspirational. More like suggestions, guidelines, like the speed limit on a Roman highway. Celibacy, the Church's perennial, glorious, and utterly futile battle against basic human biology. From the 11th century onwards, the Roman Church was absolutely adamant about its priests remaining chaste. No wives, no concubines, no secret assignations in the hayloft. You were to be married to Christ, pure and undefiled, a spiritual bachelor dedicated solely to divine service. It was a noble ideal, certainly, one that the vast majority of medieval priests observed with the diligent adherence of a teenager told to clean their room. The doctrine was clear. The reality was a muddy, sprawling, remarkably fertile mess. Walk into almost any medieval village, and if you saw a priest, chances were you'd also find a woman living in his house. Often several children, too. These women went by various names, depending on the euphemistic creativity of the local community. Housekeepers, cooks, nieces, cousins, partners, or in the less charitable but more accurate parlance, concubines. It was an open secret, a societal shrug, a collective turning of the ecclesiastical blind eye that lasted for centuries. The Church would issue decree after decree, condemnations from councils, thundering pronouncements from popes, all designed to stamp out clerical marriage and concubinage. And the priests, bless their stubborn, biologically driven hearts, just kept not doing that. The unspoken arrangements were fascinating in their complexity. Sometimes these housekeepers were openly acknowledged as wives, even if the church technically forbade it. In places like Scandinavia, Ireland, parts of Germany and Italy, clerical marriage was, for long stretches, the de facto standard, with couples going through a local ceremony, raising families, and everyone just sort of pretending Rome wouldn't notice if they squinted hard enough. Bishops, rather than cracking down, would often formalize these arrangements in all but name, collecting taxes on clerical marriages or on the children produced by these unions. It was a pragmatic approach. If you can't beat 'em, at least get a cut of their illicit domestic bliss. Imagine the parishioner at confession, confessing their own marital infidelities to a priest who, for all intents and purposes, was living in one himself. The irony, the sheer beautiful hypocrisy, must have been a daily sacrament in itself. The humor in all this, of course, is that the church was attempting to enforce an impossible standard on an entire class of men, many of whom were drawn from the very ranks of society least inclined to asceticism. The result was a constant, low-level hum of scandal, a stream of illegitimate clerical offspring who sometimes ended up inheriting their father's benefice, ensuring a sort of ecclesiastical dynasty. It was a game of spiritual whack-a-mole, played out across thousands of parishes, with the mole always popping back up, usually with another child in tow. The sheer, dogged determination of the clergy to maintain a semblance of domestic life, despite the constant threat of censure, is almost admirable. Almost. It certainly paints a vivid picture of a church that preached one thing from the pulpit, but silently endorsed a rather different, more practical, and considerably more scandalous reality in the rectory. After the rather thorny issue of celibacy, let's move on to the equally fascinating and frequently ignored vow of poverty. When a man took holy orders, he theoretically renounced worldly possessions, dedicating his life to spiritual riches. He was meant to live simply in humble imitation of Christ, untainted by the corrupting influence of material wealth. It's a lovely thought, isn't it? Almost poetic. It's also, for many medieval priests, a vow they honored primarily in the breach. Because here's the thing about spiritual riches: they don't buy you a new roof for the church, or a fresh set of vestments, or indeed that surprisingly good vintage of Burgundy you've grown fond of. For that, you needed actual, tangible, utterly worldly cash. And medieval priests, as a class, were remarkably adept at acquiring it. Through benefices, the permanent church appointment that came with an income-generating property or rights, tithes, landholdings, and a myriad of other fees and levies, many priests weren't just comfortable, they were often the wealthiest, most influential figures in their villages, second only to the local lord, and sometimes even surpassing him in practical economic power. The priestly income stream was robust and diverse. First, you had the tithe, a tenth of everyone's produce, livestock, and income. Imagine being a peasant, toiling from dawn to dusk, only to see a significant chunk of your hard-won harvest carted off to the priest's barn. Then there were fees for services, baptisms, marriages, burials, confessions, prayers for the dead, each an essential step on the path to salvation, each with a conveniently attached price tag. Beyond that, many churches owned substantial tracts of land, farmed either directly by the priest's own laborers or rented out to tenants, generating a steady rental income. Add to that the offerings from parishioners, often in kind, like eggs, butter, wool, or chickens, and you start to see a picture of a man who, far from living a life of ascetic denial, was often quite well heeled. So, when you hear about a poor priest, understand that this was often a rhetorical flourish, a spiritual justification for a man who often lived in a comfortable rectory, ate well, dressed better than most of his parishioners, and had the leisure to indulge in pursuits far removed from spiritual contemplation. The disconnect between the spiritual riches they preached and the very tangible material comforts they enjoyed was a constant source of both peasant resentment and delicious historical irony. It was a vow of poverty that seemed to apply mostly to other people, while the priest himself merely facilitated the spiritual poverty of his flock by relieving them of their material wealth. It truly was a testament to their deep spiritual understanding. They understood that gold was far too heavy a burden for the common man to carry, and so, with great selflessness, they lifted that burden from them. How very charitable! The vow of obedience. Sounds straightforward, doesn't it? Obey God, obey the church, obey your superiors. Simple. Except in the glorious, chaotic tapestry of the medieval world, nothing was ever simple. Especially not authority. A medieval priest lived in a complex, multi-layered, often contradictory web of allegiances, and deciding to whom, precisely, he owed his primary obedience was often less a matter of spiritual principle and more a tactical decision, akin to navigating a particularly vicious game of ecclesiastical chess. First, there was God, of course. But God's will was often interpreted through the lens of local custom, personal convenience, and whatever the parish priest had for breakfast. Then there was the local bishop, who was theoretically his direct superior, but who might be miles away, slow to act, or more interested in his own political maneuvering than the spiritual state of a remote village. Above the bishop, the distant, often politically embroiled pope, whose decrees sometimes took years to arrive, and even longer to be understood, let alone enforced. But wait, there's more. There was also the secular lord of the manor, who often held significant power over the church lands and benefice, and whose favor was crucial for a priest's continued livelihood and protection. And let's not forget the powerful patrons who might have appointed the priest in the first place, or the local community itself, whose goodwill and tithes were essential. This hierarchical muddle created a wonderfully fertile ground for, shall we say, strategic obedience. A priest might appeal to the distant authority of the pope to circumvent an overbearing bishop, or cozy up to the local lord to resist episcopal interference. He might cite ancient custom to ignore a newfangled decree, or lean on the power of his spiritual office to defy the secular authorities when it suited him. It was a masterful act of juggling, an intricate dance between conflicting loyalties, all while trying to maintain a straight face and pretend it was all divinely ordained. The self-serving interpretation of obedience was practically an art form. It meant whatever was most convenient, most profitable, or simply allowed the priest to maintain his lifestyle with the least amount of fuss. If the bishop demanded stricter enforcement of celibacy, a priest might suddenly find himself deeply concerned about the ancient rights of his parishioners to local custom. If the Lord demanded too much of his income, the priest might suddenly remember the supreme authority of the church over temporal matters. It was a fluid, adaptable concept, less a rigid command and more a suggestion to be negotiated, twisted, and reinterpreted as needed. In essence, the medieval priest was obedient, yes, but primarily he was obedient to the grand, overarching, and eternally compelling authority of his own self-interest. A true spiritual leader, guiding himself first and the flock second, through the thorny thicket of medieval bureaucracy. Imagine waking up in the frigid pre-dawn chill of a medieval rectory. The air hangs heavy, tasting of damp stone and the faint, lingering scent of last night's hearth smoke. Your bed is probably straw, your clothes are probably stale, and your bladder is definitely full. Welcome to the glamorous daily grind of a medieval priest. It wasn't all grand sermons and spiritual ecstasy. A large chunk of it was just work. Hard, repetitive, sometimes utterly miserable work, punctuated by moments of genuine human connection and, occasionally, the distinct possibility of divine intervention. The liturgical cycle alone was a full-time job. From the first faint whisper of dawn to the deep shadows of night, the church marked time with prayers. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. 8 times a day you were expected to interrupt whatever you were doing, whether it was eating, sleeping, drinking, or engaging in one of those unofficial pastoral duties, to chant psalms, read lessons, and commune with the divine. For a truly devout priest, these were moments of profound spiritual connection. For many others, they were an endless, monotonous, often mumbled string of Latin phrases, rushed through so quickly the Holy Spirit probably just shrugged and went back to polishing the stars. Imagine having 8 daily alarms, all demanding active participation and none of them snoozable. It was less a spiritual exercise and more a mental marathon, especially for the barely literate who might have just memorized the sounds. Then came the sacramental duties, the spiritual busywork that consumed the daylight hours. Baptisms for squalling newborns, often performed quickly before the child could succumb to the rampant infant mortality of the era. Marriages, usually quick affairs in front of the church door, binding 2 souls and their respective families' land and wealth in holy matrimony. Confessions, hours spent in the shadows of the confessional, listening to the monotonous litany of sins, lust, gluttony, anger, stealing a pig, wishing ill on a neighbor. Last rites for the dying, administering spiritual comfort as the scent of decay already hung heavy in the air. These were the core functions, the non-negotiables, the spiritual equivalent of clocking in and out. But beyond the sacred, the priest was the village utility player, the ecclesiastical Swiss army knife. He was the record keeper, meticulously or not so meticulously, recording births, deaths, and marriages in the parish register, often the only form of written history a village possessed. He was the local advisor, consulted on everything from crop rotation to marital disputes, offering a blend of genuine wisdom, folk superstition, and whatever seemed convenient at the time. He was the pseudo-healer, offering blessings and prayers for the sick, sometimes mixing them with herbal remedies, and occasionally just shaking his head while someone died of the common cold. He was the gossip repository, privy to every secret, every scandal, every petty feud in the village. And quite often, he was the primary source of news from the outside world, filtering the pronouncements of popes and kings through his own biases and understanding. So, yes, a sacred calling, but mostly a perpetually busy, often thankless, and frequently miserable daily grind. All while trying to keep his cassock clean of mud and his soul clean of, well, we're still working on that part. The medieval church was, in many ways, the primary preserver of literacy and learning in a largely illiterate world. It housed libraries, founded universities, and produced scholars whose minds sparkled like freshly polished gold. And then there were the parish priests. The scholarly spectrum among the clergy was less a gentle gradient and more a Grand Canyon-sized chasm. On one side, you had your genuinely learned men, fluent in Latin, steeped in theology, able to read and interpret complex scriptural texts with a nuanced understanding that would impress a modern academic. These were the intellectual titans, the guardians of ancient knowledge. On the other side, the vast, vast majority of parish priests, often drawn from the local peasantry, were barely literate. Their grasp of Latin might extend to the few phrases necessary for the Mass: Dominus vobiscum, et cum spiritu tuo, hoc est eniam corpus meum. They could parrot these sacred words, yes, but their understanding of what they actually meant beyond the ritualistic was often rudimentary, at best. Imagine trying to explain quantum mechanics to someone who struggles with basic arithmetic. That was often the relationship between a parish priest and the intricate nuances of Christian theology. They were reciting sounds, not comprehending concepts. It was Latin for dummies, except without the for dummies part, just the Latin. The impact of this widespread clerical illiteracy on sermons and doctrine was predictably profound. When the spiritual guidance comes from someone who struggles to read the very texts he's supposed to be explaining, things get interesting. Sermons could be garbled, relying heavily on rote memorization of common tropes, often laced with folk superstitions and local legends that blended seamlessly with actual Christian doctrine. You might get a sermon on the 7 deadly sins, immediately followed by an anecdote about a ghost in the local woods, or the miraculous powers of a specific saint's relic, which the priest happened to have on hand for a small donation. Doctrine became simplified, sometimes grotesquely so, turning complex theological concepts into fear-mongering tales of devils and demons lurking under every bed, or oversimplified promises of heaven for a well-placed donation. It was, truly, the blind leading the devoutly uninformed, with eternal salvation hanging precariously in the balance. The peasants, who were themselves largely illiterate, had no way to verify what the priest was telling them. If Father Cuthbert said that touching the tooth of St. Mildred would cure your warts and guarantee your grandmother's speedy exit from purgatory, for a small fee, naturally, then who were they to argue? He was the man of God, after all, the man who could read. This dynamic fostered a powerful, often unquestioned authority for the priest, allowing for a wide berth in how he chose to interpret or misinterpret scripture and church teachings. In a world starved for information, the priest was often the only conduit, making his understanding, or lack thereof, the definitive word, even if that word was often a blend of pious hope, ancient superstition, and outright fabrication. Sarcasm aside, it truly was a perilous situation for the souls entrusted to such guidance. In the medieval village, power was a carefully balanced, often brutally enforced equation. At the top sat the secular lord, the man with the sword and the land, who held sway over your body and your livelihood. But immediately beneath him, often rivaling him in moral and spiritual authority, stood the parish priest. He was not just a religious figure. He was an institution, a potent force whose influence permeated every aspect of his parishioners' lives. The parish was, in essence, his personal fiefdom, and his flock his personal, pious subjects. The priest's authority stemmed from his unique position as the intermediary between God and man. He held the keys to heaven, or at least the local chapter of the celestial bureaucracy. He was the gatekeeper to the sacraments, the indispensable rituals that guaranteed a soul's passage to paradise. Without baptism, you were damned. Without confession, your sins festered. Without last rites, your eternal fate was uncertain. This gave the priest immense sway, a power that could be wielded with profound spiritual compassion or, as was often the case, with chilling effectiveness for personal gain or control. His tools of control were potent and terrifying. The power of excommunication was arguably the most fearsome weapon in his arsenal. To be excommunicated was to be cast out from the community of believers, denied the sacraments, branded as a spiritual pariah. It wasn't just a social ostracism, it was, in the eyes of the devout, a direct sentence to eternal damnation. Imagine that hanging over your head for, say, failing to pay your tithes, or daring to challenge the priest's authority in a village dispute. Then there was the allocation of penance. The priest could prescribe harsh fasts, arduous pilgrimages, or significant donations to the church for even minor infractions, subtly shaping behavior and extracting resources. And finally, the blessing or withholding of spiritual favor. A simple prayer, a kind word, or a favorable interpretation of doctrine could mean the difference between a restless night and a peaceful one, between hope and despair. This is where the dark humor really shines. The wielding of eternal damnation for what might strike us today as minor infractions, arguing with the priest over the quality of your donated goat, or missing Mass because your cow was calving, was a daily reality. The priest held the keys to the kingdom, and he wasn't afraid to rattle them. Challenge his authority, question his judgment, or fail to show him proper deference, and suddenly your immortal soul was on the line. It was an extremely effective system of social control, ensuring compliance through fear of the unquantifiable. You might escape the Lord's justice in this life, but you weren't escaping the priest's judgment in the next. And that, dear listener, was a truly terrifying prospect in a world where heaven and hell were as real as the mud beneath your feet. Let's talk brass tacks, or rather, brass coins. Because while salvation was theoretically free, the passage to it, through the ministrations of your local medieval priest, absolutely was not. Welcome to the thriving economy of salvation, where every sacrament, every prayer, every blessing came with a convenient and often non-negotiable price tag. It was a spiritual marketplace, bustling with transactions, anxieties, and the faint jingling of coins. Imagine being a medieval peasant. You're born into original sin, and the only way out is through baptism. That'll be a small fee, please. You fall in love and want to marry. A ceremony by the priest is essential for a legitimate union. Another fee. Someone dies, and you want to ensure their soul doesn't linger too long in purgatory, enduring unpleasant tortures before reaching heavenly bliss. Last rites, prayers for the dead, memorial masses, all vital, all requiring payment. Confession, often a nominal offering, but sometimes more if your sins were particularly juicy, or if the priest was particularly short on funds for his new vestments. Every significant life event, every step towards grace, was monetized. It was less a spiritual journey and more a series of financial hurdles. This system, predictably, placed a significant financial burden on the poor. While the wealthy could afford lavish offerings and multiple masses for their dead relatives, the common folk struggled to pay for even the basic spiritual necessities. A poor family might have to choose between feeding their children and ensuring their deceased grandparent received adequate prayers to shorten their time in purgatory. It created a profound anxiety, a constant worry that one's eternal fate might be compromised by earthly poverty. The Church, of course, presented this as a necessary evil, a way to maintain the sacred institutions, but to the suffering, it often felt like extortion. And then there was simony, the buying and selling of ecclesiastical offices or spiritual privileges. While grand-scale simony, like purchasing a bishopric, usually happened at higher levels, a local, more pervasive version existed in every parish. It wasn't always a direct cash transaction. It could be a generous gift to the priest in exchange for a favorable ruling on a legal dispute, or for a lighter penance during confession, or for having your family's name read out more frequently during prayers. A farmer might donate his best cow to the church, knowing it would subtly influence the priest to overlook a few missing tithe payments. It was a subtle corruption, a gray area where genuine piety blurred with pragmatic bribery. So, yes, heaven has a price tag. And that price tag, often enough, varied by parish, fluctuating with the priest's personal needs, his latest indulgence, or the severity of the local harvest. It was a dynamic, ever-changing tariff system for the afterlife, proving that even in matters of eternal salvation, a good accountant was probably more useful than a devout heart. What truly makes you think, though, is the sheer audacity. Building an entire spiritual economy on the fear of damnation, and then making salvation accessible primarily through cash. It's almost capitalist, ahead of its time, really. The confessional, a dark, often cramped space, thick with the scent of stale breath, fear, and, occasionally, the priest's morning wine. It was a sacred vault, a spiritual interrogation chamber, and for the medieval priest, it was perhaps his single most potent tool for wielding control, because within those shadowed walls, he became the keeper of everyone's deepest sins and darkest secrets. Every lustful thought, every petty theft, every illicit affair, every whispered resentment against a neighbor or lord, it all poured out directly into the ears of the man who held your spiritual destiny in his hands. Imagine the power that bestowed. You, the priest, knew the truth behind every pious facade, every strained smile, every public declaration of virtue. You knew which husband cheated, which wife coveted her neighbor's goat, which seemingly upright merchant was skimming from his profits. This knowledge wasn't just a burden. It was a treasure trove of influence, a network of personal vulnerabilities that could be subtly, or not so subtly, exploited. The seal of the confessional was theoretically inviolable, a sacred trust. But medieval priests were, as we've established, gloriously human. And humans gossip. Humans use leverage. Ethical lapses, therefore, were depressingly common. The seal of the confessional was often compromised, sometimes inadvertently, by a priest too fond of sharing anonymous but easily identifiable anecdotes in the local tavern. More deliberately, it could be used for gossip, for influencing local disputes, or even for blackmail. A priest might accidentally let slip a detail that helped him mediate a land dispute in his favor, or subtly remind a wealthy parishioner of their unconfessed sins when seeking a larger donation. The line between spiritual guidance and personal manipulation was often not just blurred, but entirely erased by the exigencies of local power dynamics. Here's where the dark humor practically writes itself. The priest, sitting in that stuffy, enclosed space, becomes the original local therapy and gossip hotline. Except instead of a neutral, licensed professional, you had a man who might be judging you, might be storing your secrets for later use, and might even be your own father's brother-in-law. And the consequences for a bad review? Not just a complaint to HR, but potentially eternal damnation, or, at the very least, a public penance that would make you the talk of the village for weeks. It truly was a unique system. Absolute spiritual authority, coupled with intimate knowledge of everyone's deepest shames, creating a perfect storm for both genuine spiritual guidance and profound ethical compromise. It truly puts a new spin on pastoral care, doesn't it? The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. A timeless adage, and one that could have been inscribed above the door of countless medieval rectories. Because for all the talk of piety, contemplation, and heavenly pursuits, the pervasive problems of drunkenness, gambling, brawling, and general debauchery were not just common among the laity, but disturbingly frequent among the very men sworn to spiritual purity. The sacred cloth, it turns out, was often just a very convenient disguise for very worldly, very human pleasures. Imagine, if you will, the local tavern. The air thick with the smell of stale ale, unwashed bodies, and simmering reges. In the corner, huddled around a dice game, or perhaps shouting over a tankard of cheap wine, you'd often find the parish priest. Taverns were, for many priests, a second home, a place of camaraderie, warmth, and escape from the often lonely and demanding nature of their duties. But escape often morphed into excess. Drunkenness was a pervasive problem, leading to slurred sermons, missed services, and the occasional public scandal. Gambling, too, was a popular pastime, with priests often losing, or winning, significant sums, sometimes even church funds. Brawling, hunting, even participating in illicit cockfights. These were not uncommon entries in the episcopal visitation records, painting a vivid picture of holy men indulging in very unholy habits. The frequent scandals were an open secret, a recurring headache for bishops, and a source of both amusement and exasperation for parishioners. A priest might be caught in a compromising situation with a local woman, or found passed out drunk in a ditch, or implicated in a shady gambling ring. The church's attempts at reform were, for the most part, toothless. Decrees would be issued, stern warnings given, and occasionally a priest might be fined or briefly suspended. But given the scarcity of educated clergy and the widespread nature of the problem, serious punishment was rare. It was often easier to turn a blind eye, hoping the scandal would blow over, rather than risk alienating the local lord or leaving a parish without a spiritual guide, however flawed. So the sarcasm here is self-evident. Holy men, unholy habits. The sacred cloth, designed to set them apart, often served instead as a cloak, a convenient disguise behind which men could indulge in pleasures forbidden to their spiritual office. It wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a systemic issue, a reflection of the brutal, boisterous, and often morally ambiguous world they inhabited. It makes you wonder how many sermons on temperance were delivered with a splitting headache and the distinct taste of last night's cheap ale lingering on the preacher's breath. And it certainly adds a new layer to the phrase spiritual guidance. Perhaps they were guiding their flock by personal example, demonstrating all the sins they warned against, just to show how truly dangerous they were. Very dedicated, really. If the vow of celibacy was a suggestion, then its violation was a well-established tradition. Let's delve deeper into what was perhaps the most enduring and pervasive transgression of the medieval clergy, the institution of the clerical housekeeper, which was, in practice, often a euphemism for a wife or concubine, leading to generations of illegitimate offspring. It turns out, being a family man of God wasn't nearly as contradictory as the Church's official stance made it out to be. The housekeeper system was an almost universally accepted practice, a quiet rebellion against the impossible demands of celibacy. Picture the typical rectory, not a solitary priest burning the midnight oil over scriptures, but a bustling household. There'd be a woman managing the domestic affairs, cooking, cleaning, sometimes even helping with the church's accounts. She was often, in all but official recognition, the priest's partner, his companion, and the mother of his children. While Rome thundered against clerical marriage, local communities, pragmatic and understanding of human nature, simply accepted it. It was, in many regions, the norm. Our priest has a good housekeeper was often a coded way of saying, our priest is married and everyone knows it. And with these relationships came children. Lots of them. The status of these offspring was often complicated and ambiguous. Technically illegitimate in the eyes of the Church, they were frequently acknowledged by their fathers, lived openly in the rectory, and sometimes even inherited their father's benefice, continuing a de facto clerical dynasty. This created significant inheritance dilemmas. Legally, church property was not meant to be inherited, but practically, many priests treated their benefices as personal property to be passed down. Imagine the awkward family reunions. And this is my son, also Father Thomas, who will take over the parish when I pass. And his mother, my cousin Agnes, who cooks a mean stew. The Church, meanwhile, would simply issue more decrees, more condemnations, more futile attempts to sweep this demographic reality under the altar cloth. The Church's flip-flopping on clerical marriage and celibacy was a saga in itself. For centuries, various councils and popes would try to enforce celibacy with renewed vigor, only to see their efforts crumble against the relentless tide of human desire and local custom. There would be periods of stricter enforcement, followed by periods of quiet capitulation. It was a constant dance, a theological tango, where the Church led with doctrine and the clergy led with reality. The dark humor here is irresistible, the Church constantly denying the existence of these families, while they grew, multiplied, and often thrived right under the noses of bishops and papal legates. The surprise family reunions that weren't surprising to anyone. The endless, exasperated decrees from Rome trying to force priests into a lifestyle they simply refused to adopt. It's a testament to the sheer, unshakable power of human connection and a magnificent example of institutional hypocrisy. The medieval priest, in many ways, was truly a pioneer of the work-life balance, albeit one where life was conducted in defiance of the official work regulations. A true rebel, our family man of God. So, we've established that the medieval priest was rarely poor and often quite wealthy. But let's dig a little deeper into the intricacies of his financial acumen, because it wasn't just about collecting tithes and charging for sacraments. Many priests were shrewd economic operators, masters of leveraging their spiritual authority for very tangible material gain. They were, in essence, the local financial services and real estate magnates rolled into one, tending their flock not just for their souls, but for their economic output. Beyond the standard tithe, a tenth of all produce and income, there were numerous additional revenue streams. One particularly contentious one was the mortuary fee, often called the best beast or best garment fee. Upon a parishioner's death, the church, and by extension, the priest, was often entitled to the deceased's most valuable animal or finest piece of clothing. Imagine losing a loved one, already grieving, only to have the priest come calling, demanding your finest ox or your grandmother's best wool cloak. It was a deeply resented practice, viewed by many as a cruel exploitation of the vulnerable. Then there were first fruits, the first harvest of crops or the firstborn of livestock, traditionally offered to God, but collected by the priest. Offerings during Mass, donations for special prayers, payments for candles, for images, for burying within the church itself, the list of monetized spiritual services was long and inventive. More profoundly, the priest was often a significant economic player in the local economy due to the management of church lands. Many churches owned substantial farms, pastures, and forests. The priest, as the administrator of these lands, often became a landlord, collecting rents from peasant tenants, and sometimes even a creditor, lending money or grain at interest. This gave him immense sway over peasant livelihoods, often surpassing that of the secular lord in daily impact. If the harvest was bad, the peasant might owe the priest for their tithes, their land rent, and a loan, putting them in an inescapable cycle of debt and dependency. The sarcasm here writes itself. The shepherd tending his flock, primarily for their wool and meat. It's a harsh truth, but for many medieval priests, the spiritual care of their parishioners was inextricably linked to the economic benefits they derived. They were not just spiritual guides. They were also landlords, tax collectors, moneylenders, and estate managers, often with a keen eye for maximizing profit. It makes you wonder if the sermons on heavenly rewards were subtly designed to distract from the earthly ones being diligently collected. And it certainly highlights the deeply ingrained, often exploitative, economic realities of the medieval church, proving that even piety could be a potent engine for accumulation. Now, let's talk about a medieval perk that would make any modern criminal defense lawyer green with envy: the benefit of clergy. In a world where justice was often brutal and swift, being a cleric offered a controversial, sometimes scandalous, shield against the full force of secular law. It was a clear demonstration that being God's chosen meant quite literally being above the law, or, at least, subject to a considerably more lenient version of it. The benefit of clergy was the right of any cleric, or indeed anyone who could prove they were literate, by reciting a passage from the Bible, usually Psalm 51, the neck verse, to be tried in ecclesiastical courts rather than secular ones. Why was this such a big deal? Because secular courts often handed down harsh penalties: mutilation, branding, or the ever-popular hanging. Ecclesiastical courts, on the other hand, were generally more focused on spiritual correction. Their punishments tended to be things like fasting, penance, pilgrimage, defrocking, or imprisonment in a monastic cell. Uncomfortable, certainly, but a far cry from losing a hand or a head. This meant a priest, even if he committed a serious crime like murder or theft, might escape the gallows that awaited a common peasant for the same offense. Predictably, this immunity led to widespread abuse of power and instances of blatant clerical criminality and arrogance. Imagine the local priest, already powerful, now knowing that the worst he'd likely face for a drunken brawl or even a more serious transgression was a stern talking to and a few Hail Marys. It fostered a sense of impunity, a feeling that the sacred club protected its own, regardless of their actual conduct. There are countless historical records of priests engaging in everything from theft and assault to murder and rape, often receiving remarkably light sentences compared to their secular counterparts. It bred resentment among the common people and fueled a growing sense of injustice. The sarcasm writes itself here, of course. God's justice, apparently, involved a lot more paperwork, a considerably less painful outcome, and a significantly lower chance of ending up with a rope around your neck for those in the sacred club. It was a clear class distinction, a legal loophole that underlined the profound separation between the clergy and the laity. While peasants swung from gibbets for stealing a loaf of bread, priests might simply be reassigned to a new parish after committing far graver offenses. It truly was a unique system, where spiritual vocation provided not just a path to heaven, but also a convenient get-out-of-jail-free card. And they say crime doesn't pay. Apparently it did, if you were wearing a cassock. Lest you think the medieval priest was entirely insulated by his privilege and piety, let's remember the grim realities of medieval life. It was, for everyone, a relentless assault of disease, squalor, and the constant threat of an early, painful demise. Priests were not immune. They caught the plague, suffered from dysentery, broke bones, and lived in the same unhygienic, germ-ridden environments as their flock. The stench of disease, the chill of damp stone, the omnipresent fleas. These were their constant companions, a stark reminder that even the most blessed among them were still painfully, utterly human. Yet, despite their vulnerability, their role in dealing with sickness, superstition, and the supernatural was paramount. They were the frontline, spiritual first responders. When crops failed, the priest was expected to bless the fields and ward off evil spirits. When livestock fell ill, he would be called to perform a blessing. When a child was sickly, his prayers and relics were sought as eagerly as any herbal remedy. He performed exorcisms for those believed to be possessed by demons, which, in a time without mental health diagnoses, was a common occurrence. He dealt with local superstitions, often by integrating them into Christian practice, blessing wells, consecrating trees, or incorporating local pagan rituals into the liturgical calendar, subtly baptizing the old beliefs into the new faith. What's truly fascinating is their own belief system. For many priests, their understanding of the world was a complex, often contradictory blend of genuine Christian faith, deeply ingrained folk magic, and profound scientific, or indeed theological, ignorance. They believed in the efficacy of holy water, but might also secretly consult a local wise woman for a charm against toothache. They preached against witchcraft, yet might believe in the literal reality of elves and fairies. They prayed for divine intervention, but also understood the power of a well-timed incantation or a particular herb. It was a fluid, practical spirituality, where the boundaries between the divine, the magical, and the mundane were wonderfully blurred. The dark humor here lies in the image of a spiritual guide who might also be consulting local witches for a cure, or nervously clutching a protective amulet under his cassock. He was meant to be the bringer of enlightenment, but often carried as much superstitious baggage as his most uneducated parishioner. It's a testament to the sheer chaos and unknowability of the medieval world, where even the most educated among them clung to any perceived source of power, whether divine or decidedly earthly. And it certainly makes you wonder about the efficacy of a blessing given by a man who was also convinced that a specific toad's eye could ward off the evil eye. Very holistic, really. Very medieval. Beyond the mundane struggles of clerical life, there lay a far more sinister duty for the medieval priest, the enforcement of orthodoxy. In a world where theological deviation was not just a sin, but a societal threat, the parish priest became a local inquisitor, standing in the shadow of the stake, ready to identify, report, and sometimes even participate in the brutal persecution of suspected heretics. The shadow of the heretic was long and terrifying, and the priest was often the one holding the lantern. His role was critical. He was the eyes and ears of the church on the ground. He knew his flock intimately, their habits, their beliefs, their whispered doubts. If a parishioner started questioning dogma, interpreting scripture in an unsanctioned way, or associating with groups deemed heretical, like the Cathars or Waldensians, the priest was often the first to notice. His duty was then to report these suspicions to his bishop, or directly to papal inquisitors if they were active in the region. He wasn't always a direct participant in the torture or execution, but his initial report often set the terrifying machinery of the Inquisition in motion. The terror of doctrinal deviation was absolute. In an age of faith, a slight theological difference could literally lead to torture, public humiliation, and ultimately execution by fire. Denying the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, suggesting the Pope wasn't infallible, or simply interpreting a passage of Scripture differently from the accepted church teaching, any of these could be deemed heresy, with eternal and very temporal consequences. The stakes were literally life and death, and salvation or damnation. It was a stark reminder of the Church's immense power and its uncompromising stance on doctrinal purity. Here's where the sarcasm really darkens. Loving thy neighbor often involved ensuring their soul was purified by fire, just in case. After all, wasn't a temporary discomfort here on earth a small price to pay for eternal salvation? Especially if that salvation was forced upon them? The priest, who was meant to be a shepherd, could quickly become a hunter, sniffing out doctrinal wolves in his flock. He was the guardian of souls, even if that meant burning the bodies to save them. It's a chilling aspect of their role, a reminder that spiritual authority, unchecked and unquestioned, can lead to the most horrifying abuses. And it certainly adds a grim layer to the phrase pastoral care, doesn't it? Ensuring your flock stays on the straight and narrow path, even if you have to light it up for them, permanently. We've spent a good deal of time examining the rather earthbound existence of the parish priest. But what about those who chose a supposedly purer path? The monks, sequestered behind thick abbey walls? Or the mendicant friars, wandering the dusty roads, preaching poverty and self-denial? Surely they were the paragons of medieval piety, untainted by the messy realities of village life. Well, my curious friend, prepare for another dose of historical disillusionment. because even these purer paths had their fair share of potholes, scandals, and deliciously ironic contradictions. Let's take the monks first. The Benedictines, the Cistercians, the Carthusians, each order had its own rule, its own rigorous demands for asceticism, prayer, and withdrawal from the world. They were meant to be dedicated to God, living lives of quiet contemplation, manual labor, and communal worship. And for many, they were. But many monasteries, over centuries, became incredibly wealthy. They amassed vast tracts of land, received rich endowments from noble families, and became significant economic powers in their own right. And with wealth, well, human nature. Monks became abbots, overseeing vast estates, living lives of surprising luxury within their cloistered walls. The vow of poverty often applied to the individual monk, but not the institution, leading to abbots with their own private hunts, elaborate meals, and comfortable chambers. Then came the friars, the Franciscans, dedicated to absolute poverty and preaching in the streets, and the Dominicans, fierce intellectuals focused on combating heresy. They arose as a reform movement, rejecting the perceived worldliness of the monks. But even they, over time, fell prey to the same temptations. The Franciscans, for instance, became embroiled in bitter internal disputes over the interpretation of their founders' rule of absolute poverty, dividing into factions of spirituals who sought to maintain strict asceticism, and the conventuals who were more pragmatic about accumulating property and wealth for the order. The Dominicans, while maintaining their intellectual rigor, also became powerful, sometimes feared, figures in the Inquisition, wielding significant secular as well as spiritual authority. The sarcasm here is that just because you wear a habit doesn't mean you've shed your bad habits. The human impulse for power, comfort, and influence was a persistent weed, capable of growing even in the most hallowed ground. Monasteries became centers of political intrigue. Friars were accused of avarice and corruption, and the ideals of their founders often became distant memories, enshrined in dusty rulebooks but rarely practiced. So, while they might have offered a different path than the parish priest, it was a path still very much paved with human failings, ambition, and the irresistible allure of earthly comforts, even if those comforts were nominally for the glory of God. Turns out, a change of uniform doesn't always mean a change of heart. The medieval pulpit was not just a platform, it was a stage, a broadcasting tower, and a terrifying public address system all rolled into one. In a society where most people couldn't read and news traveled slowly and mostly by word of mouth, the sermon was the primary source of information, moral instruction, and social control. And from that elevated perch, the priest, for all his personal failings, wielded immense power through the spoken word, often delivered with a heavy dose of hellfire and scare tactics. The content of these sermons was rarely subtle. It was a potent cocktail of hellfire, damnation, repentance, and the terrifying consequences of sin. Priests painted vivid, often gruesome, pictures of devils with pitchforks, eternal torment, and the agonies of purgatory, all designed to scare the living daylights out of their parishioners and encourage them to adhere to church teachings and, conveniently, pay their dues. There would be moral instruction, of course, on charity, chastity, and obedience, virtues which, as we've seen, the preacher himself often struggled to embody. But these were often interspersed with graphic descriptions of what awaited those who strayed, It was divine fear-mongering at its finest, a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The power of the spoken word in an illiterate society cannot be overstated. The sermon was often the only communal learning experience, shaping not just religious beliefs, but also social norms, political opinions, and cultural values. The priest could relay news from the wider world, interpret royal decrees, explain natural phenomena, often through a religious lens, and reinforce the existing social hierarchy. He was the ultimate influencer, his words resonating deeply in the minds of his fearful and devout flock. When the priest thundered about the dangers of usury, the entire village would feel a chill, knowing their eternal souls hung in the balance. And this, truly, is where the ironic preacher provides a rich vein of dark humor. Imagine a corrupt, debauched priest, perhaps nursing a hangover from a night of gambling and illicit liaisons, standing in the pulpit, railing against the evils of drunkenness, gluttony, and lust. He preaches purity, temperance, and piety, his voice booming with feigned moral outrage, all while knowing full well he's violated every single one of those virtues himself within the last 24 hours. The sheer theatricality of it, the monumental hypocrisy, is almost breathtaking. It's a performance worthy of a modern reality show, except with eternal damnation as the ultimate prize. And the audience, utterly unaware of the performer's true character, hangs on his every terrifying word, convinced he's leading them straight to paradise. What a show. So, with all this spirited chaos bubbling away at the parish level, surely there was someone watching, someone maintaining order, someone cracking down on the widespread abuses? Ah, yes, the bishop. The local head of the church, theoretically the shepherd of his diocese, responsible for the spiritual well-being and moral conduct of all his clergy. But as with so much in the medieval world, the theory often diverged wildly from the chaotic reality. The parish priest, after all, didn't operate in a vacuum. He was part of a larger hierarchical ladder, a rung on a very tall, often wobbly, ecclesiastical structure. Above him sat the archdeacon, and above him the bishop, who in turn answered to the archbishop, and ultimately to the distant, often politically preoccupied pope. The bishop's role was crucial. He ordained priests, consecrated churches, administered justice through his ecclesiastical courts, and was meant to provide oversight and discipline. But this oversight was often more overlooking in practice. Episcopal visitations were the official attempts to inspect, correct, and discipline clergy and parishes. The bishop, or his representative, would periodically tour his diocese, checking on the state of the churches, interviewing parishioners, and holding inquiries into the conduct of his priests. On paper, it was a rigorous system designed to maintain standards. In reality, these visitations often proved ineffective for a multitude of reasons. Dioceses were vast, often covering hundreds of parishes, making thorough inspection a logistical nightmare. Bishops were often wealthy nobles, more concerned with their own political power, secular duties, or lavish lifestyles than with the spiritual cleanliness of a remote village priest. Apathy was rampant, and corruption at higher levels meant that grievances often went unaddressed or could be bought off. The sarcasm, therefore, is inevitable. The higher the chair, the less they saw of the actual dirt on the ground, apparently. It was a system designed with the best of intentions, but undone by the sheer scale of the medieval world, the inherent frailties of human nature, and the perennial allure of power and comfort. A bishop might issue stern decrees from his opulent cathedral, but by the time they trickled down to the muddy parish priest, they often lost all force. The bishop's eye was often conveniently averted or simply too distant to truly see the extent of the human, and often darkly humorous, chaos unfolding on the ground. It made for a highly entertaining, if spiritually questionable, ecclesiastical landscape. So, after this glorious, often squalid, and thoroughly disturbing tour of medieval clerical life, what's the takeaway? What was the public perception of these men who were meant to be spiritual guides, yet often behaved more like local tyrants, philanderers, and shrewd businessmen? The truth is, it was a complex, often contradictory mix, a blend of fear, grudging respect, profound resentment, and biting contempt. Parishioners feared their priests because they held the keys to eternal salvation and damnation, wielding immense spiritual and temporal power. They respected them as the only educated men in the village, the keepers of sacred knowledge, and the facilitators of essential rites. But they also resented them for the burden of tithes and fees, for their perceived hypocrisy, and for their often exploitative practices. And beneath it all, there was a simmering contempt, a quiet awareness of the gap between the ideals preached from the pulpit and the very earthly, very human failings displayed in the rectory. The priest was a pillar, yes, but often a visibly cracked and leaning one. It's no exaggeration to say that the widespread abuses and pervasive hypocrisy detailed throughout this journey contributed significantly to the coming religious upheavals of the Reformation. The seeds of discontent, sown by centuries of clerical corruption, concubinage, greed, and abuse of power, finally blossomed into a full-blown spiritual rebellion. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, he wasn't just critiquing theological doctrine. He was tapping into a vast wellspring of popular resentment against a clergy that had, for too long, prioritized its own earthly comforts and power over the spiritual well-being of its flock. The medieval priest, in his disturbing complexity, went from pious pastor to, for many, the ultimate punchline in history's grandest dark comedy. And they say history is boring. They say it's dry, dusty, and irrelevant. But if you've managed to sit through all of this without feeling an inexplicable urge to confess your sins, or perhaps to immediately start a new religious movement, then you understand that history, especially this history, is anything but. It's rich, it's messy, it's hilarious, and it's deeply, darkly human. It reminds us that no matter how sacred the calling, no matter how grand the institution, the human element will always find a way to make it gloriously, scandalously, imperfectly its own. If you've managed to stay awake and not spontaneously combust from all this historical depravity, consider bestowing upon us the sacred digital blessing of a subscription. Or don't. History, much like the medieval clergy, generally doesn't care.